So every year we pick a theme for our social justice work for the year, and this year we've been focusing in on environmental justice. And so it is my privilege to invite Jane Gilbert to share words with us this evening. She's the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Miami and for Greater Miami and the Beaches. She works in the city's Office of Resilience and Sustainability, where she's charged with leading the city's response to the impacts of climate change. For over 20 years, Jane Gilbert has created and led public and private partnerships focused on strengthening the community within Miami. Most recently, as a consultant, Ms. Gilbert managed the Miami Foundation's Civic Leadership Agenda on Sea Level Rise, which included coordinating the unified application of 100 resilient cities and a study on how best to communicate policy and action priorities that relate to the sea level rise. Prior to that, Jane led Wells Fargo's philanthropy and community affairs in South Florida and was the founding executive director for two non-for-profits, Dream in Green and Arts for Learning Miami. Ms. Gilbert also served on the City of Miami Sea Level Rise Advisory Committee, Beacon Council's One Community, One Goal Steering Committee, Miami-Dade County Climate Change Advisory Task Force, and the City of Miami NSP Task Force. And she's related to our very own Lisa Heller Green. So we are so excited to have you with us, Jane. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Rachel, I had asked you not to say all that, but thank you. Anyway, I'm so grateful to be here this evening. Wow, so grateful to hear the passion, the love, the spirit, and see the talent from St. Peter's. It was awesome. So awesome. And to be with you tonight, I grew up Christian, unfortunately, in a lily-white, Episcopalian church. And when I had the chance as a kid to go to a traditionally African-American church and see that spirit and love and passion, I said to my mom, "Can we go there?" Because that looks a lot more fun. So great to have you here. Anyway, climate change, social justice, and how do these relate to making Miami resilient? And what can each of us do in our lives here? So just a little about my background. I studied environmental science, but I didn't go to Maine or Colorado to study environmental science. I studied environmental science in New Orleans and New York City, where the environmental issues were different, and I could also work with prisoners. I could reach out and volunteer with homeless. I could work with youth in the Bronx and Harlem, and teach them about environmental issues and learn about what their issues were. And after graduating from college, I worked in the environmental field, but in very large national corporate fields and then international work. And I was really feeling the tug that I wanted to affect my community more locally. So I went back and studied urban community development. I really took to heart the idea of thinking globally but acting locally. And part of it was a very personal pursuit of my own, that by connecting to my own community, it gave back to me. It made me feel more connected as a whole. So what is this new idea of, I didn't study resilience when I was in school. And so what is this thing called urban resilience? It's really looking at not just climate change, but how do three big forces facing our cities today, all over the world, not just here in Miami, but Miami feels them all, a big tug of them, which is certainly climate change. We've got the impacts of sea level rise, increasing storms, heat, affecting our communities, but also population densification, urbanization. 70% of the world's population is going to live in cities in 2050, and that's as our population grows. And then finally, with globalization and technology, we're just seeing big disruptions in our economy, rising economic inequities, and a lot of shifts. What does this mean? This means that cities are facing more and more acute shocks, rapid changes, as well as chronic stresses getting worse, exacerbated. Here in Miami, we have these chronic stresses of pronounced poverty and economic inequity, of lack of affordable housing, of transportation that hits us all as a stress, and certainly climate change, which is this new sort of long-term evolving emergency. It's not something sudden, but it does make things like Irma worse. It makes things like a hurricane that much more exacerbated. And we saw that with Irma, how a storm and issues of equity can collide. In our one neighborhood of Shorecrest, we had low-income rental housing residents that were completely flooded, had to be moved out, and their cars were destroyed. And people who are struggling to just pay the bills, when they lose their car, that's a big loss. And so we saw that. We saw how with some people, they didn't have the cash on hand to buy the supplies for 3 to 5 days to survive through a hurricane. And then when you don't have power for a long time, if you're a vulnerable population, if you're an elderly, whatnot, we saw some of those risks. So the storms make us weaker, and then with the heat, we're looking at heat islands where in the inner city, they can be 10 degrees hotter than towards the coast. They also have less tree canopy, more concrete. So in the city, we've passed regulations to change roofs to be more reflective, more white. We're looking now at where the tree canopy is lacking and where we can plant more. We're doing an analysis of which trees fell during Irma and why. So when we plant, we replant more resilient trees. And we're working together with Miami-Dade County and Miami Beach on this unified resilience strategy. And really what that is about looking at some of these stresses that that many people have been working on for a long time, whether it's housing or transportation. Certainly sea level rise is a newer thing, but how do we connect the dots better? How do we get organizations, not just our governments collaborating, but working with the civic sector, with the faith-based sector, with private sector to work better and connect the dots? What does that look like? So if we're thinking about land use codes and building codes, how do we not only think about building more resilient, in other words, dealing with flood? We've already got some of the strongest wind resilient codes in the world here. We're a leader in that, so let's be a leader in flood resilient codes, but also how do we think about land use from an equity standpoint in terms of affordability, and how do we connect people through where we have the affordable housing to access to transportation and to jobs. If we're thinking about the city of Miami, we just passed, our voters, thank God, passed a bond called the Miami Forever Bond. $200 million of that will go approximately to flood mitigation, sea level rise measures, $100 million to affordable housing and economic development, and then the remainder to parks and other infrastructure. And I see the whole thing as a resilient bond, because whether we're building affordable housing, we want to make sure that it's going to be built in a place that's not going to flood, in a place that's going to be wind resilient, that's going to be cheap in terms of utilities, so energy efficient, water efficient. It's going to be thinking about where it's placed, close to transit lines, et cetera. And it's going to leverage private capital. This is how we bust down silos. If we're thinking about the flood mitigation infrastructure, well, that's a huge investment. How do we make sure that people are getting access to those jobs and those opportunities? How do we design this infrastructure in a way that works with the environment and adds more green space and more livability for our residents? And finally, how do we really think about it? I think I've mentioned all of it, but finally, certainly protect us from flood over time and reduce our insurance costs locally. So those are the kinds of things. Sometimes I think of myself not as the chief resilience officer, but the chief silo buster. I'm bringing people together to think about things, connect dots, identify efficiencies and innovation. How do we move forward on things? So where does this connect back to all of you and your work in your lives, right? So one of the great things I love about Judaism, and I've been practicing Judaism for about 18 years now. I got part because I married into the tribe, but also because I really love that it's about wrestling with God, and it's questioning God is not something that is steered away. You face head on what might be idiosyncrasies or hypocrisies or things that don't make sense. Same with Tikkun Olam. It's about healing the world from a very holistic standpoint. And the way I got into this work, what I think, it's not just because it's the right and moral thing to do, or even because I want to protect our world for my kids and their kids, but it's because when I reach out to others, when I reach out and connect with others and heal them, when I am connecting with nature and trying to heal those things together, it makes me whole. It makes me feel better, happier, more fulfilled. And I think when we get to a place when we're doing things for the world, feeding the homeless, planting mangroves, whatever we do, what we buy, how we treat each other, it's because it feels good. It's because we do it for our own personal fulfillment. And so I think the way to moving towards climate justice, towards environmental justice, is really thinking you can start at the home from your purchasing and your own how you treat people at your work, your employees, how you reach out to in your businesses, how you think about your operations, your labor practices, how you connect what you're doing to others. This is how I think of environmental justice, climate change justice. We're all in this together, and our planet's actually very small, and our community's even smaller. And it's really, yes, we need strong leadership at the top, but it's not going to be any one atlas that's going to save the world. It's not going to be any one national leader. It's going to be the small actions of all of us that build up. And so it's going to be how we treat each other every day, how we treat, from our kids to our families to the people in various neighborhoods. We live in a richly diverse community, but we often live separate from each other in those. So how do we challenge ourselves to get across and reach across? It's such a beautiful thing this congregation has made those bridge building here tonight. And so I think that is how we heal our community and heal our world. Welcome to talk to anyone who's at the dinner later with any questions. Thank you very much.